During Operation Midnight Hammer, the US bombed Iran into oblivion. It took out a trio of Iran's most important nuclear sites. That was good news for Russian President Vladimir Putin, in a sense. The US focusing on Iran meant that President Donald Trump's attention was pulled away from the Ukraine war. No US attention meant Putin could continue his war of attrition without worrying about calls for peace. That's changed. Trump is now demanding an end to the Ukraine war after the US success in Iran. The question now is whether that peace has any chance of happening. Between June 24th and 25th, the leaders of NATO nations met for a summit in The Hague. Trump was among the many who took part in the event, and he had some interesting things to say, both about the US's role in NATO and Putin. Speaking for Times Radio's Frontline show, former British military intelligence officer Philip Ingram examined those comments and came to several interesting conclusions about how Trump now views the Ukraine war. First, the comments themselves. When quizzed about the US approach to Article 5, Trump went on a slightly rambling discourse that took in both Article 5 and the Ukraine war. For context, Article 5 is essentially NATO's one-for-all and all-for-one rule. It states that if any NATO member is attacked on its own territory, the rest of NATO is duty-bound to come to that ally's defense. It's rarely triggered, with the only time it's been used being in the wake of the terrorist attacks on the US on September 11, 2001. Trump has been quizzed about it because his NATO allies are worried about whether he'll follow Article 5 if Putin attacks a NATO ally. The US president's response hopefully put those concerns to bed and may have sent a message to Putin. "I stand with it. That's why I'm here. If I didn't stand with it, I wouldn't be here," Trump told reporters. Trump then segued into the US bombing of Iran during Operation Midnight Hammer and what that may mean for the Ukraine war. You can find out more about that operation in our video, B2 Operation Midnight Hammer just obliterated Iran. However, the key takeaway from Trump's comments at the NATO summit is simple. Putin offered to help, and the US refused. Some great statements just came out from the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission and from Iran, as you know, that it was a complete total destruction, Trump said. And CNN turned out to be fake news as always. That's why they have no credibility. That's why they have no viewers. Trump went on to grind his axe with CNN a little longer, claiming that the outlet showed no respect to the US pilots who completed the bombing mission in Iran. But then he got onto the subject of Putin. When asked if he believes that Putin has territorial ambitions beyond Ukraine, Trump noted, "It's possible. I mean, it's possible. I know one thing, he'd like to settle. He'd like to get out of this thing. It's a mess for him. He called the other day, he said, 'Can I help you with Iran?' And I said, 'No, you can help me with Russia. You help me get a settlement with you, with Russia. And I think we're going to be doing that.'" Trump continued, concluding, "Vladimir Putin really has to end that war. People are dying at levels that people haven't seen before for a long time." There's a lot to unpack from these comments, as Ingram explains. The first and perhaps the key message that Trump sent to Putin at The Hague is that the US underpins Article 5. That's bad news for Putin. Russia's leader had hoped he'd sown enough doubt about NATO in Trump's mind that he might be willing to abandon the collective defense organization. Back in March, that certainly seemed to be the case. The Guardian reported in that month that Trump made comments suggesting that the US wouldn't come to the aid of a NATO member that was attacked if that member wasn't paying their way. "It's common sense, right?" Trump said in the Oval Office. "If they don't pay, I'm not going to defend them. No, I'm not going to defend them." Trump claimed at the time that NATO members should be paying more. And that's precisely what seems to be happening. The Hague saw NATO collectively agree to raise its members' recommended defense spending to 5% of their national gross domestic product by 2035. Trump was delighted with that decision. "It's a monumental win for the United States because we were carrying so much more than our fair share. It's quite unfair, actually. This is a big win for Europe and actually Western civilization," the BBC reports Trump as saying. There was a lot of debate going on beforehand as to whether the United States would live up to that agreement, Ingram says. But Donald Trump has been quite clear in what he said. In other words, the US has thrown its weight back behind NATO now that Trump has achieved his goal of convincing its other members to raise their defense spending. That's bad news for Putin on two levels. It means that he has to deal with the US if he doesn't bring an end to the Ukraine war, and those NATO members are now spending more than ever on their militaries. Both of these facts are leverage for Trump. They allow him to push for peace in the Ukraine war, knowing that Putin knows there's a clear threat on the horizon. More worryingly for Russia's leader, Ingram says, is Trump's admission that there's a possibility that Putin may look beyond Ukraine and toward Europe. Ingram says, "I was intrigued to see Donald Trump saying this. It's that Vladimir Putin may have ambitions outside Ukraine and elsewhere." Ingram labels this a change in the subtle language that comes out of Donald Trump. because it showcases that the current US administration is looking toward a future where Putin may invade other countries other than Ukraine. Again, that's problematic for Putin. It demonstrates that Trump is viewing him in a different light than he viewed the Russian leader a few months ago. This subtle language change suggests Trump may now see Putin as a threat in the wake of the Iran bombings. And with the Iran job over and done with, from the US perspective, Trump now seems prepared to throw his full weight back behind achieving peace in the Ukraine war, with this new view on Putin and his actions. What does all of this tell us? For one, Ingram points out, it seems that Trump is growing increasingly frustrated with Putin and his attempts to stall peace negotiations with Ukraine. Trump's refusal to allow Putin to serve as a mediator in the dispute between Iran and Israel is just the latest sign of this frustration, Ingram points out. I think Donald Trump is beginning to get slightly frustrated with Vladimir Putin, and we may see a change in Trump's attitude over the coming days and weeks, he says. There have been other signs of this growing frustration. On May 11th, Trump took to Truth Social to lambast Putin for a renewed round of Ukrainian bombings following the Russian president's self-declared Victory Day ceasefire. President Putin of Russia doesn't want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, but rather wants to meet on Thursday in Turkey to negotiate a possible end to the bloodbath. Trump raged, suggesting the subtle shift in attitude we saw at The Hague was coming. A few weeks later, Trump also claimed that Putin was playing with fire because of his refusal to enter serious peace talks, with Trump also adding in another Truth Social post, "What Vladimir Putin doesn't realize is that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have happened to Russia, and I mean really bad." We even saw signs of this frustration before Trump arrived at The Hague for the NATO summit, as he told reporters that it's a shame that a peace deal hasn't been reached yet. What all of this tells us is that Trump may see that his initial tactics for negotiating with Putin have failed. Russia's leader has blocked peace discussions at every turn. In early June, which is right around the time that Israel's campaign against Iran began, which the US later joined, Putin set out his conditions for peace. Those conditions essentially amounted to Russia's leader wanting Ukraine's complete and utter capitulation. Those terms, per Max Seddon on X, included the withdrawal of Ukraine from all the regions that Russia has occupied on its territory, a pledge from Ukraine to never join NATO, and massive caps on Ukraine's military. They were not peace terms. They were Putin saying that he wants Ukraine to set itself up for a future invasion by weakening itself to the point where Russia could take it at any time. No wonder Trump is frustrated. He sees Putin's supposed peace terms as the delaying tactic they are, and now that the Iran bombings are concluded, he seems to be aligning himself deeper with NATO to force the issue. Beyond Trump's growing frustration, which was on full display at The Hague, the NATO summit also provided an opportunity for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy to further ingratiate himself with the defense collective. Zelenskyy spoke at The Hague, and when he did, he delivered a strong call for justice, as Ingram reports. It will take strong political and legal cooperation to make sure every Russian war criminal faces justice, including Putin. And importantly, they are also the result of Europe's commitment to justice, to holding evil accountable not just by force but by law, by courts, by verdicts based on proven guilt. These are clever comments by Zelenskyy because they align with what Trump is trying to achieve. Zelenskyy, though still pointing out that force is required, is saying that a legal approach is needed to deal with Russia. In other words, it's not just about missiles and bombs, it's about words, negotiation, and in Zelenskyy's ideal world, the prosecution of those who've persecuted Ukraine. For Trump, that tells him that Zelenskyy is willing to cooperate should the US pursue Russia by means other than a direct show of force, which feeds into Trump's desire to achieve peace. The NATO summit also offered an opportunity for the collective defense organization to showcase its support of Zelenskyy and Ukraine. President Zelenskyy was in there and amongst them, Ingram says. That was a very strong political statement to Vladimir Putin that he has accepted. Zelenskyy is playing a very careful game. The summit saw NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte labeled Russia as the world's single biggest threat, with NATO's European members also announcing agreements totaling around $40 billion during the event. Think about what all of this means for Putin. He's seeing NATO, as a collective, embrace Zelenskyy at a time when he's calling for Ukraine to pull away from any collective defense organization if it wants to achieve peace. At the same time, he's watched Trump reaffirm the US commitment to NATO in the wake of the group agreeing to raise its defense spending recommendations to 5% of GDP. All of this is leverage that Trump could bring to bear in future peace negotiations. And the worst of it for Putin is simple. The Iran bombings showcase that NATO could do some serious damage to Russia if Putin refuses the peace that Trump wants. What Israel and the US achieved in Iran earlier in June showcased just how ineffective Iran's air defenses are against coordinated aerial assaults that utilize modern US fighter jets. That's a problem for Putin. Why? Well, because the Iran strikes exposed key vulnerabilities in Russia's air defenses. Many of the air defense systems Iran uses, including the S-300 and S-400, are Russian-made and deployed using a similar philosophy to that seen in Russia. Defense Blog points this out, noting that Russian commentators understand exactly what this means in the context of a war between NATO and Russia. Everyone here understands that is exactly what would happen to Russia if any NATO country decided to act, Defense Blog reports one of these commentators as saying. Adding to the problem is that over 3 years of war with Ukraine has already wreaked havoc on Russia's air defenses. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia has lost 1,191 of its anti-aircraft warfare systems, most of which have been taken out by drones and missiles rather than concerted aerial assaults. What Iran proved both to Trump and Putin is that the types of defenses Russia would rely on to fend off a NATO assault simply don't work. NATO would be able to achieve aerial superiority over Russia's skies. All that Russia is left with is vague threats and desperate attempts to paint the ongoing transformation of NATO as a sign that the organization is about to collapse. In the wake of the 5% spending announcement, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was asked if this could result in the fall of Putin's regime. Lavrov's response was cloying and desperate, as he said that Putin can probably see, since he is such a wise sage, that the disastrous increase in spending of NATO countries will also lead to the collapse of this organization. Meanwhile, Russia, as President Putin said the other day in Minsk after the Supreme Eurasian Economic Council meeting, plans to reduce its military spending and be guided by common sense rather than imaginary threats, as NATO member states do. That's some way to spin the situation. Russia is spending less not because it's in economic turmoil, Lavrov seems to be claiming, but because Putin is guided by common sense. That simply isn't the case, as former US ambassador to Ukraine Kurt Volker explained to Ingram on Times Radio. They're now in a weaker position, Volker claims. They view us as weak and indecisive, but when we act decisively, they know that they don't have the ability to match that. Volker goes on to claim that Putin had been guilty of a series of misjudgments over the past 5 years, including misjudging Ukraine's strength, the power of Russia's military, and the West's collective unity. What does all of this have to do with Trump's renewed calls for peace in Ukraine? Simple, it's all leverage. Beyond dealing with Trump's changing attitude, Putin also has to confront the fact that NATO is far more capable than he claims. That's especially the case now that Trump has confirmed the US commitment to Article 5. Any future invasions Putin has planned in Europe now lie in tatters. The Iran bombings showcase just a sample of what the US is capable of doing with its air force against Russian aerial defenses. Putin now knows what would lie in Russia's future if he doesn't make peace. Plus, it wouldn't just be the US launching aerial assaults if Russia started a war with NATO. Most NATO members use US-made aerial platforms, with even those that have their own fighter jets building them to NATO standards that allow for cooperation in the skies. Putin knows that Trump can use all of this as leverage. The US president can essentially point to Iran and tell Putin that was just a microcosm of what the US, backed by NATO, could rain down on Russia. So Putin better become serious about peace. If he doesn't, Trump will only grow more frustrated, and with Iran, Trump has also proven that he's a president who's willing to take action when he believes that negotiating isn't going to get what the US wants. All of this leaves Putin with a lot to think about. But it also brings us to the final question we'll ask in this video: will the peace Trump wants to achieve happen? There's a good chance it won't, at least according to Volker. I don't think we can emphasize this enough. Putin is different now than he was when he first took office, in the sense that he has built up an authoritarian, repressive regime where he's the sole authority. He has built up military capabilities and intelligence capabilities and disinformation capabilities. Volker goes on to say that Putin has demonstrated an ideological drive to rebuild the Russian Empire. Therein lies the problem. Putin can see that he's placing Russia in a lot of trouble by continuing his campaign in Ukraine, and will create even more issues if he expands his scope to the European nations that once fell under the Russian Empire. But he doesn't care. What he's doing now is about legacy, ideology, and Trump may have realized now that the only way to deal with a man like that is to show him that you're not willing to play his game. The NATO affirmation and Trump's renewed calls for peace are messages to Putin that the US, like its NATO allies, is now taking the threat Putin poses very seriously. As for whether peace could happen, Ingram asks Volker if it's possible that we could be living in a safer world at some point during the next 12 months. The former ambassador's reply is pointed. I think it all depends on Vladimir Putin being in power. If Vladimir Putin remains in power, we are going to have a threat-driven world. We're going to look at the war in Ukraine. We're going to look at potential conflict elsewhere. In other words, Putin has to leave the scene for there to be any chance of achieving the peace Trump wants. A new Russian leader doesn't guarantee peace. There's always a chance that Putin could be replaced by somebody as hawkish as he is. However, at least according to Volker, there's little chance of peace as long as Putin reigns. Putin's ideology won't allow it. So where does that leave Trump and his renewed call for peace? Right now, it's all about building leverage. The US can see that Russia seems to be in the process of stockpiling missiles. On June 27th, The Telegraph reported that Russia is using Chinese companies and Russian intermediaries to avoid Western sanctions so it can get its hands on the components it needs for its missiles. The outlet notes that Russia produced 700 Iskander-M ballistic missiles in 2024, which was a substantial increase over the 250 built in 2023. Russia has used these missiles to conduct more intense strikes against Ukraine. However, it's not using all of them, The Telegraph says, which suggests the building of a stockpile. That stockpile might be intended for whichever nation Putin wants to invade next, or it could be a sign that Russia's leader is digging his heels in for an even longer war with Ukraine. Right now, we don't know. Russia is also engaged in a summer offensive, which Putin also hopes will give him some leverage. In Sumy Oblast, Putin has amassed around 50,000 troops to create a buffer zone between Ukraine and Russia's border regions. However, that attempt to gain leverage may already have failed. June 26 saw Ukraine claim that it had stalled the Sumy offensive before it ever really got off the ground. Elsewhere in Ukraine, Putin is dealing with manpower and equipment problems that are dramatically slowing his ambitions to gain more territory that he could use as leverage in peace negotiations. Trump sees all of this. And perhaps the US president senses a growing weakness in Putin that, when combined with the leverage he's just gained from his NATO affirmation and the Iran bombings, makes him believe that he can force Putin to get serious about peace. Trump has made his demand. We can only wait to see how Putin responds. And while all of this is happening, Russia is losing more and more of its equipment. It's just been revealed that Ukraine's secretive SBU has inflicted over $5 billion worth of damage to Russia since Putin began his war. That's more leverage lost. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more commentary on the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you, as always, for watching.